All right, just as a couple of stragglers come in here, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you here. Welcome to Electra House. And on behalf of the team at Advanced Business Consulting, I'd like to thank you for joining us at this fantastic event, Innovators 2021, How We Survived, celebrating innovation and success in South Australia. It's a real treat to be able to come together physically in a room together with drinks and no Zoom backgrounds and no one's inadvertently muted, though you may wish we were in an hour, and a wonderful space too. For those I don't know, my name's Troy Forrest. I'm the Managing Director of a company called Strategy Road here in Adelaide, and it's a real pleasure to introduce this conversation tonight, one that I know is going to offer some terrific, valuable insights to other leaders of great South Australian organisations. Before I introduce them though, can I take a moment to please thank our hosts this evening, Advanced Business Consulting. John Paul and his team for more than 20 years now have been helping and partnering with a vast number of well-known as well as under-the-radar organisations in South Australia and around the country, helping them to get the most from their technology and building a technology advantage. And they're also very, very generous hosts having us here tonight. It's a terrific initiative. It will add a lot of value to all of you. And we've got some people beaming in via the live streams here. So we are on camera here tonight, ladies and gentlemen, so watch my language. I really want to thank you, JP, and the team. Could you join me in a round of applause for John Paul and the Advanced team? This great event's also being supported by the terrific team at M-Files Document Management Software, one of the flagship technology solutions that the Advanced team deploy to help their clients as well as to manage their own organisation. It is a remarkable technology solution. We've got a couple of wonderful guests from M-Files here tonight who are very generously supporting this event, and so please have a chat to the Advanced team about that technology afterwards. Our three guest presenters tonight are leaders of organisations that chose to lean in and embrace the opportunities that existed within the change and the challenges that the last couple of very discombobulating years have presented to most organisations. So in a period of widespread disruptions and uncertainty, where many organisations sat on their hands, gnashed their teeth and thought maybe we'll just wait for some semblance of calm to resume, these guys didn't. They leaned in. They zigged where others zagged, if you like. And they and their teams chose to do what genuine leaders do, which is to move forward, to take a step forward positively and thoughtfully while others stayed put. And tonight they're going to tell you a little about how they've been tackling the pandemic, how disruption has affected their organisations, and how they're utilising technology as part of their path forward. So I'll introduce our three presenters now. Mr. Andrew Bullock is the Managing Director of 1834 Hotels, which is a leader in the hospitality industry around the country. They provide management and consulting support to a wide range of hotels, motels, apartments, resorts and similar. And in one of the hardest hit industries through the pandemic, hospitality, deeply and adversely affected, Andrew and his team saw the opportunity that existed in the interruption their business had been dealt, and they took it upon themselves to implement a new core business system and business intelligence capabilities with a view to free up their staff, with a view to unearth valuable data-related insights and really give them a distinct advantage as their industry starts its rebirth. So Andrew will tell you a little about their journey and some lessons learned. We'll follow Andrew with Mr. David Smith, who's the Manager of Corporate Services at Meals on Wheels SA, an organisation a great many of you will know. Founded in 1854 and nearly 70 years later today is delivering fabulous, enticing and exciting food, a lot like what we've been eating out here, to thousands of South Australians every single day. And as an organisation staffed with a large number of volunteers, dealing with many vulnerable people during the pandemic particularly, Meals on Wheels needed to find ways to simplify and streamline some of their financial and business processes, really to reduce their burden on staff, as well as improve efficiencies and compliance. So over the last couple of years, David and his team have undertaken a project that has seen the reduction of the burden of onerous manual tasks and made accounts and volunteer reimbursement processes much more robust and faster. And he'll tell you a little about that. And finally, Mr. Peter Crescitelli is the IT Manager at Medical Insurance Group Australia, or MIGA, one of Australia's leading medical indemnity insurance providers for doctors. MIGA have been on a journey of digitising a number of their manual paper-based processes, again with a view to delivering efficiencies, compliance, and critically to deliver a better customer experience for both internal and external stakeholders. So Peter's going to share a little about how their team went about identifying and implementing some smart technological solutions to add value to their business. After Andrew, David and Peter have shared their stories, I'm going to ask them to come and join me up here on stage, and we're going to have a little panel conversation, and that's an opportunity for you guys to ask some questions that you might have. So if, as we're going through this discussion, if you can hold some questions in your mind, and we'll bring those out towards the end. So, without further ado, I'm going to invite from 1834 Hotels, Mr. Andrew Bullock, to come up here and talk to you. Thanks, Andrew.
Fantastic, thanks very much, and certainly thank you to JP and the Advanced team for inviting me to come along and have a bit of a chat today. A great opportunity to, I suppose, share some stories about what's been a tricky time for our industry and a tricky time for a lot of industries as well as people over the last couple of years with the global pandemic that we've faced. I thought to give some context around that and I guess where we've been at. Firstly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about 1834 and how it got to where it was prior to the pandemic hitting it some couple of years ago. So we're a hotel management company. At its core, we look after hospitality assets on behalf of owners. I started out in the hotel game in about 2002, pretty raw at that stage, and I was working in sales and marketing and probably thought I knew more than I ever did. And I worked for a really lovely gentleman, guy by the name of Ian Connolly. And Ian was an old motelier back in the day. He'd been acquiring motels right around South Australia and a little bit interstate and overseas as well. And Ian took me under his wing and showed me many ropes and took me on a bit of a journey. And so I worked through with him, working into operations, and then became the general manager of his group. Unfortunately, Ian passed away from a blood cancer in 2008, and at that stage, it was quite a tricky time. As you know, it was about a month after Lehman Brothers had collapsed, and the world was in somewhat turmoil. And so the leader of our organisation had obviously tragically lost his life, and it was particularly tricky to see where we were going to go from there. At that stage, we had about 4 or 5 hotels under our management. And a number of those which Ian and his family had significant investments into. So at that stage, I took the opportunity to take on the business, and I took over the management arm of that group at that stage, and that was very much with the support of Ian's family and endorsement of them, and very fortunately we were able to, I suppose, stem the situation that had occurred, start to work our way out of that, and then start to grow. And so one of the things that we had as a challenge early on was obviously starting to get our head around the broader implications of that business, shareholders and various things, and there was a lot of different investors that were involved. But one of the key metrics to that was we knew that one of the things that was going to set us apart was the ability to be able to utilise technology and create efficiencies. And it wasn't that long thereafter that I actually met JP and the Advanced team, and they put us on a journey of that technological advancements and things that we were able to bring to an industry that was probably a step ahead of many of our peers. And so we continued to grow, and sometime a little bit after that, I brought a business partner into the business, and then not long thereafter, we were running a large number of hotels for a fund manager that was based in Sydney, and we operated their hotels right around the country, as well as a number of others, and they started acquiring some of the assets of which we had. So previous to that, or certainly at that time, we were running hotels such as the Mayfair Hotel here in the city, the Dabco, we had the Clare Country Club, the Barossa Winetel, McCracken Country Club, so you get a bit of a flavour of the sort of assets that we were looking after. We had a dozen different hotels in New South Wales, we had a variety of hotels in WA, so it was quite a national footprint. And when we were working with this company, they took a position that they're actually looking to acquire, and they were growing at a rapid rate. And so we actually went through the path of selling from some of our other investors some of the assets, and we sold both Mayfair and Adabco hotels, we sold the Clare Country Club and the Barossa Winetel, and all of those settled between December 2019 and January 2020. bit of a stroke of luck. Not for us so much, but anyway. So for that company, it was a very interesting time. We obviously went through that first period of time, and it was particularly strong. Those hotels were all performing very well, and they were at the top of their game. And that company was doing exceptionally well, and they continued to do so thereafter. But when we hit the pandemic, or that March period of time, and the shutdowns occurred, what happened was we actually lost the entire contract from that fund manager, and fair enough, they took a position where they were going to internalise those assets, and they were looking to reduce their cost base as much as possible. So unfortunately for us, 1834 were one of the people that had to go out of that, and so we lost quite a large market share during that period of time of COVID. That was sort of day one. So I remember at that stage we were about $100 million a year business. We had about 1,100 staff, and basically from that shutdown announcement on that Sunday night to the Monday morning, we went from 1,100 staff to about 250 overnight. Pretty brutal, many of which I personally had to go through the process with, and it was very, very tricky. And I look back on it now and just wonder how we got through that first period. Going through the staffing issues that occurred, it was an incredibly tricky time. So I certainly don't want to have another global pandemic to have to work through like that. But out of that came opportunity, and over a period of time we started to settle, and the industry started to work out where it was going to be. And whilst hotels and hospitality have certainly been one of the heaviest impacted, there's many other industries that were as well. To be in the airline industry, to have been in the travel agency industry, tourism broadly was incredibly tricky times. So for us it was about let's take stock, let's work out where we're at. And let's try and think about some things that we can do to try and regrow this business and get it back to where it was previously. At that time, we met with Advance once again, and we actually looked at a whole heap of opportunities that we could do to create efficiencies within our business model, which meant that as we regrew the business, we didn't have the same cost base that we'd had previously. And it was incredibly fortuitous. We took the opportunity during that period. We actually completely flipped the property management system that we use within the business itself. We undertook a process, and I remember sitting down with JP, and he said to me, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Well, I wasn't sure, but I said, yeah, we definitely want to do this. But what we did do was we took the opportunity of that time when things were somewhat quiet to be able to turn over a property management system and create a new version which actually had far more efficiencies, and the long-term impacts of that have been incredible. And so I must say we're forever grateful for that conversation and the process that we went through, because now as we're regrowing and we've started to take on new hotel contracts again, what we're finding is those efficiencies are actually setting us apart from our peers. And so it's giving us an opportunity to actually be able to grow a business which is far more efficient than it was pre-COVID. And whilst I hope that we'll be back well in front of the 30-odd hotels we had prior to that period of time, I don't think we'll end up with the same level of complexity from a staffing arrangement or processing arrangement. So it's been a great thing to have sort of come through. I'm never very good with PowerPoint presentations. I seem to just rattle on and forget about the fact that they've got some stuff up in there. So just about 1834, I talked about there before, hospitality management. We're a business-to-business operation. One of the things about 1834 is that we don't really have a brand. We're not a brand that you would see in market. You don't go to an 1834 hotel. It's very much about we operate on behalf of owners of hospitality assets, and we're essentially an extension of their operation. And so that's a really tricky thing as well, because one of the challenges we have is that when we're looking to grow and improve our position in market, it's actually very much about finding investors and other business people which are associated with the hotel industry. It's not necessarily about the consumer knowing what we are. But what we do is highlight the consumer brands of which we're using. And the Mayfair Hotel's probably a really good example of that. When we first went into Mayfair, one of the things that we looked at was, does this require a brand? And does this require something that sits over the top of it? And the theory that came out of that was it definitely didn't. We had the opportunity to actually create a brand and create something that was quite unique and different in South Australia at that stage, rather than just branding it with an international chain. That, of course, brings about its own challenges, but also with that great opportunity. And so for us, we're very, very much at the core of focusing on our business-to-business assets, but also then developing individual brands for various owners. The other side of that is we do some franchising, so we will bring in franchise brands over the top of 1834 as necessary. So, as it says through there, more than management, it is very much about a total holistic approach. Just a couple of the things that I wanted to touch on today, and these are the items, I suppose, that we've used from Advance over a number of years. With the hotel market, one of the key elements is very much around rooms and our dynamic pricing model. So for us, we look at supply and demand curves on a daily and sometimes down to every 10 or 15 minutes. We're looking at the movements of our room stock and the price points thereof. And so one of the things that Advance was able to bring to us was the ability to better analyse our data that we were looking at for our forward bookings and the movements of those forward bookings. And so dynamic pricing, absolute key thing to what we're bringing to the table, very much a big part of the technology aspect that we use. Daily operation reports, will show you a couple of those in just a minute. Cost reduction, benchmarking, group purchasing, of course, technology once again becomes a big part of that. One of the elements that we did roll in was around reporting. So our daily reporting was a critical element that was very manual, and it was something that we used to have staff actually go in and we'd have spreadsheet after spreadsheet after spreadsheet, and we found that it was just an inefficient model. And whilst we were able to extract reasonable levels of data, that data was taking a lot of time and a lot of labour in order to achieve that. And so we created a custom report with a group of different data sources that came in, which actually gives us all of our key statistics every single day from the hotels. And we look at it, and we also look at our wage positions, how many rooms have been pre-sold, how many meal covers there were, and so forth. A whole range of data which pumps through every day and then looks at those analytics against budgets last year and so forth. And so those, I suppose, those analytics and that data information allows us to make better decisions about what's happening in the hotel environment. I touched on before the dynamic pricing model. This one here is just a bit of an example of what we look at on a daily basis, and then we bore down deeper into this data with revenue teams and dynamic pricing. So this is looking at, for example, what we were holding on the books at any given time within a month. One of the things that Advance were able to do for us was also to show how many rooms had been picked up on a day, how many rooms were picked up at a certain time, at certain price points, and that really gave us the ability to start diving into data. One of the things about this, of course, is you can start to see spikes, and so if Saturday night in 3 weeks' time suddenly spikes, that's the ability to push your price points up. And this information was really critical for us being able to improve the performance of these hotels. A little bit about the systems architecture, where it's coming from, bookings going into a data warehouse, and then we use click and printing, reporting stuff into PDF and Excel documentation for our final user use. We have a variety of different programs which feed into that, and here we've just sort of touched on a number of them. ProTel was actually the PMS that I was talking about, the property management system I was talking about before that we rolled in. We also use RMS and Oracle. WageLock, represented here with Peter tonight, are one of our great partners and a very important cog in the wheel, because that also looks at the labour cost and the effectiveness of that within the hotel industry. And then we do have a group of other information which flows into those daily reports. I touched on ProTel. Reaction to lockdown, don't panic. Easy to say now. I think there was probably a number of weeks of sleepless nights, and so one thing I would say, I was very fortunate through that period of time to have a mentor that was the CEO of the large operation in Sydney, and he's a really, really good guy, and he'd done some amazing things. But just prior to 2008, or in 2008, he had a very successful funds management business which he sold to Lehman Brothers, just prior to Lehman Brothers going under. He also became the head of Australia for Lehman Brothers at the same time, Asia and the South Pacific, in fact. And so he managed to weave his way through that period of time, and obviously had a massive impact on him. But also what it did do was it gave him some great insights. And I think the things that he passed on to me during that period of time, I'll never forget. And it was very much about, don't panic, but act quickly and act with a level of go a little bit harder than you thought. And that's what we did. We did go very, very hard initially, but when we bounced back out, it was very fortunate that we'd taken the really hard decisions early on in that process. So I look at it and say, don't panic, but go hard. Make the decision and make the decision quickly. That's probably just a little bit about the planning, the property management system. One of the reasons, and I touched on it, that JP and I had that discussion around changing the property management system, we were looking for efficiencies. And at that stage, there was the overlay of, in a pandemic environment, customers were actually looking for a different experience in their hotel, where we had very much a focus around customer service and customer-facing operations previously. We suddenly had consumers that didn't want to talk to people. They didn't actually want to be faced with having to go and talk to someone at check-in and go through a process like that. And one of the huge benefits of switching over our property management system was we were able to create, with remote lock-ins, a completely you could self-check yourself in and get your room locked to your room, and you didn't have to see anyone. And so it was a massive part of the benefits that we saw coming out of that. And as I say it was driven by a better customer experience. And interestingly enough, some of the lessons that we learned from that in the early days have been fantastic for us later on in the business. So that's a bit of an overview, I suppose, of 1834, how we got to where we are today and some of the challenges that we faced throughout the last 18 months or 2 years. I'm really pleased to be able to come and present here, but I'm also really pleased that we've made it through. There was certainly times during the last 2 years that I thought that the business wouldn't make it, and that we had such a level of difficult trading conditions in our industry that it just wouldn't be sustainable. But I'm really pleased. You know, we've got a lot to look forward to. Still tough times at the moment, but as the borders open and we start to see New South Wales and Victorians start to travel back into South Australia and in time, when it's appropriate, internationals as well, I'm really confident about the industry here and the industry across Australia. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
Andrew, thank you so much. And I think it's really powerful and positive to see such an optimistic story coming out of a space that we understand, has undergone some pretty challenging things. Don't panic, but go hard. I'm going to come back to that in the panel conversation because it's interesting to have a mindset like that and then bring a team along with you. I'm a Carlton supporter, so we'd really dearly love a little bit of that happening in our football club. But I won't digress. I'll now invite Mr. David Smith, Manager of Corporate Services from Meals on Wheels SA, to share their story with us. David, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to Advance and John Paul for the opportunity to share some of Meals on Wheels' story with you today. I must admit, after listening to Andrew's talk there, I do feel a bit of a phony because I realise that there are a lot of organisations who've been doing it really tough during the pandemic, and you'll probably notice from our talk that Meals on Wheels has actually had it relatively easy. I'm not saying the work hasn't been difficult, but in terms of life and death of an organisation, we've been actually very well placed. What I'd like to do is walk you through a little bit about Meals on Wheels. Any group that you speak to, you can ask who's heard of Meals on Wheels, and almost universally everyone in the room has heard of Meals on Wheels. And if you ask further, how many of you have a family member or someone you know who's received Meals on Wheels? Same question, or who's volunteered for Meals on Wheels? And even those two questions, you get well over 80% of the crowd saying, yes, we know that, and telling you stories of their auntie or their mother or who's been a volunteer or a customer of Meals on Wheels. When I started at Meals on Wheels, I thought I had some idea about the organisation, and indeed most people who start have some idea about the organisation, but they generally remark, actually I really had no idea at all. They have a very outdated idea of what it was like, often based on the 1954, 1960 type model of how things were. So just a quick history recap. Meals on Wheels in South Australia was the first Meals on Wheels delivery service in Australia. It was established by a lady called Doris Taylor. The Victorians claim that they were first, but they had one old person deliver a meal to someone about a week before, so they said they started first. But the first actual proper one was here in South Australia. And Doris Taylor was a remarkable woman. She had an accident when she was a teenager and became bound in a wheelchair. And she, in that time, noticed that when people got sick and went to hospital, particularly elderly people, they couldn't come out of hospital because they couldn't feed themselves. And so that meant they had to go into a convalescent home, which meant that they couldn't maintain their house. So the act of getting sick to an older person meant the end of living independently and being institutionalised, Doris thought, unnecessarily. And so she established Meals on Wheels to try and make sure that when people, all they needed to be able to live independently is someone to give them food. In typical South Australian fashion, she politicked a bit, had good mates with Don Dunstan and people like that, and there was a bidding war between Norwood and Port Adelaide to see which council was going to give her the best deal to set up Meals on Wheels. Port Adelaide won, and so that was the first branch of Meals on Wheels which was established. But back to present day, we're currently delivering 4,300 meals a day to clients in South Australia. We're a statewide association. Everywhere else in Australia, the Meals on Wheels outlets are actually independent entities, whereas we're the only one that actually has an organisation that covers all of the state. As you'll see possibly as we go through the presentation, there's some big advantages of that, and there's some huge disadvantages as well. On the one hand, we have some efficiencies. On the other hand, it's like herding cats. So 4,300 meals a day, that's about 6,000 customers a month, 7,000 volunteers. That's a huge number, and what did I say there? About 70 staff. So we're very much a volunteer-based organisation. The vision you can read for yourself there. It's basically ambitious and wants people to be independent and healthy and living with dignity in their own homes. Profile of our customers. I'll show you some numbers in a minute, but typically the Meals on Wheels customers have difficulty in cooking or shopping for themselves. They fairly strongly are elderly. Many of them have special dietary needs, and by that I mean they may need gluten-free, they may have dysphagia and have difficulty swallowing, so they need minced moist food that they won't choke on. They may need high protein because something which isn't known among the older population is there's high degrees of undernourishment because they just don't eat enough to keep strong and healthy. So then when they fall, they break a hip and then they become hospitalised and they don't recover. And you can see how the journey goes from them living independently and becoming quite expensive to the government as well as diminishing their quality of life. The government supports most of our clients, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail later. And of course, with this cohort, food safety is a very critical thing for us. I'll just quickly go over the whole profile of the organisation a bit more. The clients I've spoken about, I'll show you some numbers in a minute. 7,000 volunteers. Average age of our volunteers is about 75. And something that surprised me the very first year I was at Meals on Wheels, we do an annual awardee day where we recognise people who have volunteered for a long period of time and achieved life membership. So life membership is 15 years of service. We also on that same day have 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50 years of service. The first time I went to one, when they got to the 40 years of service, I was astounded. There were about 40 people standing on the stage. And I asked someone, is this something you do every 5 or 10 years? No, we do this every year. And there were 40 people who'd been volunteering for 40 years. The other thing that was actually quite noticeable was the profile of those people. It was almost like Menzies was still in power and we had a White Australia policy. They were universally Anglo-Saxon women. And when you think about it, in the 60s, women, as soon as they got married, had to leave the workforce or had children. And so they naturally went to volunteering. And having started volunteering in their 20s, it wasn't unreasonable for them to continue through for those years. So that presents a little bit of a challenge for us moving forward. Our branches. I mentioned we have 80 of them and it's an association, but the gestation of those branches is varied. Some were at a point in history an independent operation in a country town or a region, often coming out of a public hospital, where the public hospital staff cooked the meal and organised things and worked with volunteers. But of course then with cutbacks and things from state governments, those branches came under the umbrella of the Meals on Wheels Association. Not in all cases did they come under the umbrella of the association completely willingly. And so also when new branches were set up by the association, remembering that there was no such thing as internet and computerised activities, the branches were set up to be fiercely independent. And so they managed their own affairs. They had their own committees, their chairs, treasurers, their own bank accounts, checkbooks, and basically ran their own show with just a central governance going over the top. And the point that I'll illustrate a bit later about our change to financial processes, on the one hand, looks like something very simple. You're just automating or digitising a simple payment process. That's true. But the net effect of that change was to be able to radically change the whole financial structure of Meals on Wheels and how it operates. So up until a few years ago, each of those 80 branches, even though not legally independent entities, thought of themselves as independent entities, and that central office was just a nuisance. And there, if they had a problem, but not to tell them what to do. And it worked very well for 50 years. But of course, with the increase in compliance and safety, work health safety, volunteers recently are now counted as workers. So all of your work health safety processes have to apply to 75 to 80 to 90-year-old volunteers who've never had to touch that muck in their working life. They've always stood on a ladder on top of a table to change a light globe. So why would they not do it now? You can see how the complexity gets there. Okay, so these are people who use our service, and you can see quite a big peak there at the 85-year-old plus. One of the ongoing challenges is people from branches, often newly retired people who've worked with technology in their working life. New board members often say, when I get to be 85 or 90 or a Meals on Wheels user, I'm going to be different because I'm computer savvy. I can do online ordering. I've got a credit card, and so Meals on Wheels needs to change to be able to deal with clients like that. What they're missing is the fact that my mum's 90. She was always able to use a microwave and a stove. Now she's 90, she can't. And just because you can use these things and you're computer literate now, doesn't mean that when you're 85 or 90, you're somehow going to be magically better. And so this market for people who are getting older and some of their capacities have diminished, they're always going to need a meal delivered to their house. One of the points that we make a lot about is it's not just a meal delivered to the house, okay? Because that can be picked up by anyone. Anyone can drop a box. You might have seen the adverts there. Most of these clients couldn't get to the front door and pick up the box. And if they could pick up the box, they probably couldn't heat it safely. And regularly, several times a week, volunteers turn up to deliver a meal to a client who is expecting the meal, and they don't answer the door. So our protocol is that we check if there's anything visible there, we ring the next of kin, and they can check up on their mum or dad. Last week, for example, we had a daughter send us a lovely email saying that had happened at one of our branches. They'd rung her, she'd gone round to see her dad. Her dad had been on the floor since the night before. He'd had an aneurysm. They got him to hospital, he was operated on, and he's alive. And so that type of thing is really at the core of what we do. And I know it doesn't appeal to geeks and things, but there's not a lot that technology can do to help that. You know, it's that personal touch of someone knocking at the door and saying hello. Just a little bit on our meal supply, because I've got to touch on some of the projects that we were fully committed to before COVID. So COVID hasn't really impacted on us very much in a negative way. You know, the demand for our services has actually increased. We're considered an essential service. It's really been quite a blessed run. However, we had made plans which we couldn't back out of. And so that was the challenge. We couldn't have just stopped doing what we're doing, because those people who I showed you on the graph, there were no other options for them. If we weren't delivering meals to those people, particularly those with special diets, no one else delivers those meals, not in a form that can be heated. So jumping ship halfway just wasn't an option for us. So anyhow, our food comes from fresh cook kitchens. So about 40 of our kitchens cook the meal fresh each day by volunteers. They get there at 7 o'clock in the morning, chop up all the ingredients. Some of the creative older men, we've managed to stamp this out, but it does creep in occasionally, sharpen guillotines. This is what they used to do. Sharpen guillotines to help chop pumpkin. Which is a terrible work health safety hazard. But anyhow, their practices are much, much better now. And so, like I said, about 40 of our branches cook fresh each day with volunteers cooking the food and then, of course, delivering it. We have a number in country areas where we purchase the meal from Country Health, where the hospital cooks the food and our volunteers just deliver it. That's presenting currently some challenges for us because, of course, even the volunteers going to the hospital to pick up the food have to be double vaxxed and meet all the requirements of going into a high-risk environment. And then, of course, we have a bit of a showpiece here, which is our cook-chill facility, which produces probably about a third of the meals we do each day. And that's the new facility at Hilton that was on the initial slide. We were well and truly underway to building that. In fact, we were about to move into it in March, April, May last year. And so that was certainly a bit of a challenge with everything that was going on with COVID. Among other things, that produces all our frozen meals and all our special dietary meals. So I've spoken a little bit about the autonomy of our branches. So these are some of the challenges that we have. We have this group of volunteers who have been encouraged to be incredibly autonomous and parochial and take pride in their environment, which is difficult to therefore implement change. There's a high number of them in a low frequency. And so you can imagine from an IT point of view, if you have to put a secure internet connection in a branch and a managed computer, and that computer is only going to be used 1 hour, twice a week or 2 hours or something like that, it's quite a big investment for a very small use case. And also, you don't know who's going to be using it. It might be 20 different people in a branch who's using that computer. So that's a bit of a challenge for us. ICT hygiene is a term I like to coin because, as I said about work health safety, the idea of cyber safety is a bit of a no-no for some of our volunteers. So security is really quite important for us. And I said our devices are in the wild. So basically, a lot of our IT infrastructure is away from the mothership, unsupervised, unguarded, with no staff there. So that's a bit of a scary thought, really. Your security really has to work quite well. And in a previous life, I worked in education, and kids were very creative at what they could do with computers to muck them up or make them difficult for other people to use. And I thought, it'd be great working with grown-ups. They won't damage things or try and use them inappropriately. It's not quite true. They still are quite creative in what they do. The next bit about itinerant workers. Not all of our branches actually have a physical office with a space that they can call their own and therefore an internet connection and a computer. So a number of our smaller branches, particularly in the country, rely on using either a Meals on Wheels computer or their own personal computer to log into our systems. It sounds fairly familiar these days with people doing a lot of work from home, but that type of work from home has been embedded into what Meals on Wheels has been doing for more than 10 years. And so Advance, through Matt and Luke, have been really instrumental in helping all of our system design catering for that, I guess, that lowest common denominator of you need a computer to be spun up quickly, safely, in an environment where someone's effectively working from home. And so when the pandemic hit and our staff had to work from home, it was really very easy because that's just what we do with all of our branches and all of our staff who are on the road or working from home. The main change I want to talk about from an IT point of view here is our structures weren't working for us. And so this is pre-pandemic. So I mentioned about the branches and their autonomy. So what used to happen was branches every fortnight when we invoice our clients, we would send the payment for the meals which were delivered by that branch back to that branch. The branch would have a treasurer and a checkbook, and invoices for goods that they'd purchased to produce the meals would go to the branch. They'd sign off on them, the treasurer would write a cheque, someone would countersign the cheque, and sometimes we'd pay invoices for them. We would then send them another invoice to pay us back for the things we'd paid for them. Every 3 months we'd do a reconciliation on a simple electronic cash book where we could check that things have been coded reasonably accurately, and if we'd advanced more money to a branch than they needed, we would ask them to send it back to us, to central funds, and some branches don't operate at a profit because we believe that we should offer a service wherever it's needed, independent to its financial viability. So we would give money to those branches to prop them up. So it wasn't a loan, it was I guess an equalisation type scheme. Excuse me. So what became fairly obvious is that was pretty inefficient. So the first little toe in the water we decided is if we could stop branches having to pay their own invoices, that would be really handy. How do you get 80 branches to be able to effectively send invoices into central office for payment? Obvious answer they wanted to do is send it in by fax, which some still do, but of course that really just pushes the workload elsewhere. And so in the conversation with Matt, we looked at M-Files as a document management system to facilitate branches being able to just scan an invoice, sign to say they've received the goods, it was okay to pay, and then a workflow so it could be paid at central office. Any process like that falls over with the exceptions. It can work in 9 out of 10 places, but the few places it doesn't work because they don't have a computer or an office or an internet connection becomes a challenge. So M-Files was great because we could actually fall back to a mobile phone to do the same thing, or an iPad. And in a couple of cases we still use the fax. But what that meant is no longer were branches needing to pay any bills. What that also meant, some of the treasurers were quite smart, was that meant we didn't need to send them any money, because if you don't need to pay for anything, you don't need any money. And so we were able to close all their bank accounts, their checkbooks, and stop sending this money backwards and forwards. So we managed to, by what was a fairly simple business process, just automating or digitising invoice payment, get a whole lot of other benefits. What that meant was once we'd closed all the branch bank accounts, as well as saving $50,000 a year or so, we were able to at last change the whole financial structure of Meals on Wheels, which leads us now to implementing Pronto as an ERP for dealing with our manufacturing. One of the points in that process change was, I was just talking about the project. I've skipped ahead of where I need to be, but that's okay. I'll come back to that. The centralised payments. One of the key obstacles of that was driver reimbursements. So we reimburse our volunteers for out-of-pocket expenses, and those who use their own car, which all of them, to do deliveries, we pay them currently $9 a delivery round reimbursement for their petrol and wear and tear. And they used to be paid in cash up to 5 years ago, and generally a treasurer would go down and get whatever the amount of cash was, put if there were 5 delivery rounds, 5 envelopes with $9 on the table, and the driver could take the money, and if they didn't take the money, it got scooped into a bucket and then banked as donation. And so before that we encouraged them, or forced them really, to stop being cash payments and go to direct credit. And so the process to round that out was this next one, again using M-Files, which was to start to automate that process. So again with Matt, we moved that processing of driver payments because we collect a declaration from the driver to say what their bank account details are for payment. We need that to be secure, and so that's stored in M-Files. We also got some improvements when we were doing this because we realised that while we're doing it, it would be really quite useful to check that the person we're paying a driver reimbursement to is actually a volunteer. Not that we really suspected fraud, but sometimes for good intention, people get roped in to be a deliverer and stay for 10 years, but they're not actually on the books. And if they're not registered, then they haven't had a police check. And also if they have an accident, they're not covered by our insurance. So right through this process, we found little extra added gains from simply just trying to improve a process, but for very little extra effort, tighten up on a whole lot of other additional benefits. So the driver reimbursement was a really good example of that. just a quick anecdote on that. One branch from Whyalla rang me and the treasurer said, I've worked really hard to get the drivers not to take cash payments, but there's these 3 old guys and they're refusing. They say, if you don't pay us in cash, we're not going to deliver any more, and we're really desperately short of drivers. So I said to him, look, you've done a really good job. We can live with that. That's fine. We can still get what we need to have done. He said, no, leave it with me. I'll go back to them. He got back to me a week later and he said, I've convinced them, but the reason why they wouldn't stop taking cash payments was because it was the only money they had access that their wife didn't know about, and they could go to the pub. So, process change occurs in a context. And so the driver reimbursement and the processing of invoices and M-files, in a business sense, we think is really very simple, and it is a simple business change, but the benefits for us have been great. Conscious of time, I just quickly want to go back to the bits I skipped over. Also, around or before the time of COVID hitting us, as I mentioned, all our devices are out in the wild, and the security consciousness of our users is highly questionable. And I'd like to thank Luke for his constant pestering me of the need for increased cyber security, because we put a couple of things in place. One was, how do you connect all of these remote locations back to central office? We were using Telstra's 4G Next IP network to have a private 4G WAN. Before COVID, we started migrating across to using SD-WAN with Meraki teleworkers, and that's proved to be incredibly successful. It also means that we're sort of not carrier dependent, but the huge additional benefit was, because we had some stock of these devices, when our staff had to work from home, it was a trivial matter to give them a network device with a SIM card in and connect them and get them working. It also meant that it was really easy to deploy and to manage the profiles on those. So again, it was an accidental benefit that really set us in good stead. And the more recent one was the application whitelisting and stopping programs running that were not supposed to. And it's not a particularly interesting one, really, is it? But I must admit, it does enable me to sleep a little bit more safely. And you tend to think when you work for a for-purpose organisation that you might be free from the nasties of hackers and other cyber bullies. But of course, we all know that's not true. That they'll attack wherever they can. And as I started by saying, Meals on Wheels is really well known, and so it becomes a fairly obvious potential target if you're after nefarious activities. So that's really a bit of a potted run through of Meals on Wheels and some of the things we've been doing. Thank you.
David, thank you very much, and a remarkable organisation doing really important work, and a terrific story of how moving on from fax machines and envelopes of cash and leaving whatever's left behind to go into a bucket. JP's staff would like to be paid a similar way. I don't think any's going to be left to go into the bucket, though, I'm afraid. So I'll invite our third and final speaker to come up and join us if I can. Mr. Peter Crescitelli from Medical Insurance Group Australia. Peter.
It was me. Thanks, JP. That was a good icebreaker for me. All right. So Medical Insurance Group Australia, MIGA, we provide medical indemnity insurance to doctors, midwives and healthcare organisations across Australia. We've got a history that dates back about 120 years, as do our processes, which you'll probably see shortly. We service approximately 33,000 members across Australia, and that ranges purely from medical students to fully insured doctors to GP practices to, again, healthcare organisations. it's an industry which is very price driven, as all insurance is, of course. We're based out of Franklin Street, about approximately 90 staff, and we have about 15% of the medical indemnity market. There's about 5 other players in that space, so it's really important that we look to deliver efficiencies to reduce our expense ratio. Being a very price-driven business, we need to be in a position where we can reduce our premiums to compete with the larger players based out of New South Wales and Queensland. MIGA's tech journey, I know it's a little bit probably difficult to see there, but we first engaged Advance back in 2017 to help us with an MFiles implementation, which was initially delivered to our claims and legal team. So claims and legal, traditionally late adopters in technology and moving away from paper files as such. And as that's essentially a department that is very customer focused, so it's really important that we look to gain some efficiencies there with the deployment of that product. At the end of 2019, we decided that we were going to engage in a system replacement, which was a multi-million-dollar project which spanned a tight time frame of approximately 18 months. And in hindsight, probably not the best timing. So early 2020, COVID hit, which brought a lot of complexities, as we all know, but probably the biggest complexity for us was that the project implementation team were based out of USA. So we did expect them to be on site come early 2020. So we were in a position to determine if we wanted to press on with the project or pull the pin. At that point, the board and the business made a decision that we would press on because we've already invested. So yeah, more about that shortly. Just when we thought we didn't have enough on our plate, we also decided to implement a new GL product with Microsoft Dynamics. And then, yeah, I'll also be talking about what we've done with invoice approvals post the COVID pandemic. We went live with the insurance system in May 2021 this year. So across, some of the other projects that we've done, we always had the insurance system replacement operating in the background, and let's just say thank God for Zoom. The time zones were crazy. Having project meetings at 1, 2 in the morning. A lot of the implementation team were based out of Boston in USA, so that proved quite complex. So like I touched on, MFiles was initially deployed to the claims and legal team, and prior to that, they had paper files and manila folders for claims records. So you can imagine every time we wanted another solicitor to know where the previous solicitor took off, we'd have to go find that paper record in the compactus, come out. So there wasn't the ability where we could provide a genuine customer service, and the efficiency just wasn't there. And like I touched on before, we've got some staff members that are in that department that have been in the business for about 15 or so years, and traditional solicitors like taking a briefcase or a suitcase to court. So we then had to get them thinking about, well, now you can take a laptop instead, but that still poses a bit of a challenge. To date, I'll probably say that MFiles was a game changer for the business. Up until that point, they were very paper driven, and they still are. There's a lot of opportunities that we can look to implement further with our client services team. So we still have manual client records and paper records in a compactus. So part of our strategy moving forward is to extend MFiles to other areas of the business. So the insurance system that we replaced, it was the biggest project at MIGA, and probably will ever be one of the biggest projects at MIGA. So up until that point, we had a policy billing and claims system in operation for about 15 years. It was initially a system that was geared towards insurance brokers, and as MIGA got involved into the insurance arm, it was originally a mutual. We customised it quite heavily to suit the needs of the insurance arm of the business. Do that over 15 years, and you can imagine the legacy product that we had, which was quite complex in terms of what we had to think about in deploying and migrating. So approximately 20 years of history that we had to migrate, probably even more that we had in other legacy systems too. Then it's really important when you're dealing with insurance, particularly medical indemnity. There's a lot of personal information, sensitive information, so customer files, patient records for claims. There's the livelihood of all the doctors, reputations at stake if you get that wrong, and the wrong person, sees those types of records, and that's where M-Files really helped us, really driving security. So you can implement security right down at the file level if you need to, and if someone goes to search for it that doesn't have the security, it just doesn't appear. So it's a really useful tool. Look, user experience as well. So from a change perspective, a lot of the staff had never experienced a project implementation like this before. So we uplifted our resources. We engaged the stakeholders as best we could in terms of building out those business requirements early on as well. And like I touched on earlier, our biggest concern that we had to think about was, how do we continue running this project when we don't have vendors on site? And that did prove difficult, but during COVID we worked with it because we didn't really have any other option at that point in time. So navigating through COVID, so in addition to early on the M-Files implementation, the system implementation as well, there were some other operational type efficiencies outside of the insurance system that we need to look at as well. And one of those was really looking at, well, there's a number of manual paper-based processes that are still in operation outside the insurance system. And one of those was invoice approvals. So traditionally, Fin Services, a very paper-driven business, highly regulated by APRA. Part of the reason why everyone at the business still prefers touching that piece of paper, because if an audit comes around, you have a stack of information you can provide them, and it just feels like it's, I guess, more of an audit if there's more paper, I don't know. But so up until COVID, we would approve invoices by printing them out, stamping them, coding them with a pen. We'll pass it on to finance. And COVID hit, and this was actually a project which I was looking to get off the ground for a number of years, and it was never a priority until COVID, because we, again, didn't really have any other option. So we actually had to come up with a way where we could approve invoices electronically when everyone was working from home. So we managed to do that in the space of about 2 weeks. And me and my team, it was all performed internally. So over the years, and again, we've had M-Files in place for about 4 years to that point, we're quite confident in developing a workflow in terms of what are the steps that an invoice would go through to get that approval steps in place. And that was great. Everyone from the finance team to anyone that approved an invoice was always like, well, why don't we do this sooner? It's always the comment at the end of the project. But at the time, it wasn't a business priority, but COVID essentially pushed forward our digital strategy, so to speak. So we now have the ability where at any point in time, we can bring up an invoice, we can see the stage that it's at, if it's paid, if it's pending approval, as well as the search function as well. So just putting an invoice number into M-Files, you get that information straight up. So for a business, if you work for a business or you own a business that is largely paper-driven, M-Files is a game changer. Highly recommend the product, and it's never ending in terms of the capability. So like I said, we've done it for claims, our claims team. The next step is our client services team. And the more you use it, the more familiar you come with the product, and I think the workflow capability is just really easy to learn, and you don't actually need to be too technical either. So yeah, like I mentioned, the user adoption was seamless there, and the process did deliver cost savings and internal efficiencies, particularly around archiving invoices off-site, which is no longer a requirement. So I thought I'd just take a quick screenshot in terms of what that workflow would look like, or does look like for a HR invoice, for example. So there's a series of steps, and this is all drag and drop capability that you can do with M-Files. It's really just the process that we'd work through is we'd sit down with HR to say, well, what do those touch points look like? When you're approving, who has to approve? At what point does it go to finance and so forth? So in this case, the HR coordinator would approve an invoice. It would then have to be approved by the HR manager or reviewed by. It then passes on to finance, where they enter it in the system, and then it moves through its payment state to paid. Here's an example essentially where I've brought up an invoice. I've searched for invoice number, and down the bottom right hand corner there you can see that the status shows paid. And essentially going back a few steps as well, is that you can set up security where only particular members or staff members can progress that invoice. So at each state here where you have orange and you've got kind of the arrows in between, you can set up, again, notifications where when it moves to this state, it then notifies another person in the business. So really, really useful, and we've done that across all our invoices across the business. So in wrapping up, what does the future look like? So I did touch on that, improving operational efficiencies is really important for an insurer like MIGA. We will look to go one step further with the integration of the M-Files invoice approval, integrating straight into Microsoft Dynamics. So what we're actually doing is taking out an accounts payable resource that would normally still have to enter the invoice. We are now looking at that if it gets approved in M-Files, it'll just go straight into Business Central Microsoft Dynamics, where it'll go into a batch. So there's really not a requirement for any data entry whatsoever. So we're looking to do that early next year. I also mentioned extending M-Files to the client services team, which is a strategy of ours, and looking to digitise all the client records and all the manila folders and removing a compactus, which takes up a fair amount of our square meterage in the office. So, and then really looking at how we can integrate M-Files further. So we already integrate M-Files with our insurance system for claims, obviously, but how we can look at further establishing the security components around client data. So the added benefit to all of this as well is the audit function that comes with M-Files. So any time any user makes a change, it's logged, it's tracked, and when you do, again, heavily regulated environment, always have to provide evidence of reasoning and why things were done. It's really easy to do with that audit capability that M-Files provides. So that's it, everyone. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Thanks, Peter. You can hold on to that one. I'll grab another one.
No worries.
Peter, thank you so much for sharing that, I guess, the journey that you guys at MIGA have undertaken. I think a lot of people in this room would share your sentiment. Thank the Lord for Zoom, but if we don't have to use it as much next year, that would be even better as well. I'm now going to invite our three presenters to come and join me up on a panel, and you've got a microphone there, and I'll ask you to spend 10 minutes or so just asking a few questions and get a couple of questions from the audience before we wrap things up and let you guys enjoy some networking. I'm also going to ask one other presenter to come and join us if he would. Mr. Brandon Hegg, who's come across from WA for this conversation. Brandon's M-Files Channel Senior Sales Engineer for ANZ. Have I got that right? Beautiful. He's a civil engineer by training, spent a long time in IT, owning computer and photocopier businesses and working in enterprise content management for large government and multinationals. And we thought it would be really terrific to have Brandon perhaps comment on, I suppose, a couple of lessons. I just wanted to pull a couple of threads together, if I could, common to all of your organisations and journeys, as different as they are, from the hospitality sector, from managing a team of volunteers, providing that for-purpose benefit, looking at building efficiencies into an insurance organisation as well. And one of the threads that sort of struck me was this balance that you've each had to navigate between looking for ways to bring efficiencies into your organisation through technology, automation, etc., but at the same time keeping one eye very firmly focused on, let's call it the customer experience, the hospitality customer experience, whether it's your volunteers, whether it's internal customers as well. Can I ask perhaps the three of you to share just a couple of comments on what you've learned as business leaders about striking that balance, striving for efficiency gains while never losing sight of the people who we need to delight via what we're doing. Do you want to offer up a comment on that first, Peter?
Yeah, sure. So I think the best way to think about it is, if it's delivered at a high level, and the importance of customer focus is that to be competitive and to take that next step, you need to kind of walk the talk, so to speak. And it's not really just about coming up with ideas. What we've found is that everyone always had some great ideas, but you need to put them into actions. And we had strategy meetings, and we'd always talk about let's think about doing this, let's think about doing that. But it's really important. I think you touched on earlier about going hard. It's a really, really good comment that I think just if there's good justification and there's a good business case, and in most cases you can generally see it very early on, then just go ahead with it. I think it's really difficult to try, put into so many words, but actions, not so much ideas from my perspective. Yeah.
Fantastic. Maybe just pass the microphone around. Yeah. Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, to be honest. I think efficiencies can actually give customer experience improvements. And I think when you're working through the range of experiences or efficiencies that you're looking for, keeping customers at front of mind is incredibly important. But often what we're finding, and particularly in changing dynamics for the customer's requirements or what they're looking for, is that sometimes now, certainly I think post-COVID, but even pre that, by producing a more efficient system is actually improving your customer benefit as well.
I probably disagree with the going hard, certainly in our context, because it's very much a softly catchy monkey. And if you can find a champion, or you can get success early with someone and actually prove that what you're trying to implement works, that goes a long way to getting other people along the journey. And I think whether it be the elderly volunteers or even fully paid staff members, people still get a bit of a buzz out of learning something new, a new trick, and being able to do something better. And I found there's no better advocate for any change than someone who's actually using it and is prepared to tell anyone and everyone, even if they don't ask, why this change is actually so good.
Yeah. Terrific, thank you. I might just hold with that topic for a second, and the idea of bringing people along, particularly during a period where people have felt wrong-footed, people have felt a bit frightened by, the massive amounts of disruptive change that have been going on in their lives. And then you as leaders of organisations have gone, and we're going to change a couple more elements in our organisation at the same time. And logically they kind of make sense, but still, I'm adding change on top of change in terms of, what's already, feeling pretty tricky. What have you learnt about as leaders of your organisations about making sure you do bring the team along and you haven't spooked the horses too much in the process of driving these efficiencies?
Yeah, change fatigue is a very real problem. I guess on the positive sense, though, is that change indicates to people there's hope and something is better in the future and there's going to be some continuance. I guess also being highly selective about where you push the change. So you might have a preconceived idea of the change process you're going to have, or which bits are going to be changed in which order, but sometimes your initial thoughts might need to be revisited to take into account that the people who are actually impacted by that change are actually real people, and just because you're ready for the change, they may not be quite ready. They might be in a few weeks' time.
Sure.
I think David touched on it really well earlier about champions. Whenever you're going through a change management process, I think if you get the right people within the organisation that become champions for that change, it makes life as a leader a lot easier, because essentially that heavy lifting is being done for you at the ground level.
Yeah, so I'll probably draw on the implementation of M-Files, which I touched on earlier, to our claims team. There were probably a couple of key staff in that area that had been in the business for 15 odd years and really struggled with what the business was about to implement. But there was a champion as such, a senior manager, so not executive level, senior manager, which really drove it. And what I found is that some of the detractors early on that were concerned with the implementation of this change, whilst they were brought along for the ride early on, they actually became, when we went through it, the subject matter experts. So I think probably the ones that just need a little bit more guidance, you'll find if you do it correctly, they actually become one of your biggest assets.
Terrific, thank you. I might throw the microphone order in a complete disarray and come over to Brandon if I can, so do the little relay across. Brandon, you obviously work with a lot of organisations around the country who are going through, technology information enhancement, transformation processes as well. You've heard 3 leaders of 3 really successful organisations, I guess, share a little of their journey. What would be 1 or 2 key takeouts that you might offer this business leader audience around what commonly underpins the success or otherwise of a technological transformation process in an organisation?
Yeah, look, the biggest thing I think is that whenever you're doing an IT project, it has to be a partnership. There are so many people, and I apologise for them in our industry, that take the T in technology and run with it. And they miss the human aspect, they miss the cooperation. And we've heard from these guys that whenever you're implementing a project, it has to have user acceptance. And if you go into it with the IT bull at the gate, you're going to fail. You have to have a partnership. It's where, from MFile's perspective, we have partners in Australia whose job it is to interface between our technology and the customer requirements. And it has to be that communication with the needs of the project and then mapped to the technology. The technology is in a way secondary. I say that, but MFiles has the cutting edge technology, but we don't roll that to the customers as the reason they should put it in. We roll it to the customers as the efficiency or the benefit to the users, or COVID has been great for us because the ability to work from anywhere. We heard, I can take my iPad, I can do my invoice, it can access the file share that's on the server in the office that I can't go to anymore. So that technology is there, but none of that matters if you take that technology and apply it incorrectly in the project. You really have to have a partnership between the people implementing it and the people who have the need. And that definition, to get that right up front so that you're actually implementing a solution that everyone agrees is what they want, is what is going to make the efficiencies. Because the other thing about IT projects is they don't tend to make money. It's not something that you can easily justify because we're going to make 20 sales, or we're going to dig more dirt, or we're going to do anything. An IT project costs money. So it has to be able to generate efficiencies, generate process improvements, generate a better customer experience, or something like that in order for your business to actually justify doing it in the first place.
Fantastic, thank you. I've got 1 or 2 more questions just to round the conversation out, but this is a great opportunity to turn it over to you guys. Does anyone have any questions of any of our panellists before we wrap it up? Please, sir.
Hi, I'm Sam from Colnet. I work in machine learning space. Is there something within the product that you can get to a data lake and find patterns that you didn't know were already there?
MFiles is introducing artificial intelligence as part of the next stage of MFiles. It's here now, and yes, we can work with knowledge graphs. We can start pulling some of that information out. In terms of accessing data lakes and things like that, there's probably better products to do it. I'm a IT person for 30 odd years, and I've seen all of them come and go. And I will tell you when something's good. It depends what you want. MFiles can do it, but you again it's an IT, that's technology. Yes, we can do it. It depends what your requirement actually is, really.
Any other questions of any of our panellists and presenters here? No? I can tell I'm standing between you all and a drink and some food that I can start to smell. So I'm going to wrap this conversation up with one more question of each of you. And it's really about looking towards the future, and it's thinking about, we've taken some terrific steps forward in terms of, transforming, enhancing, bringing efficiencies into our organisations via the smart application of technology. What's the one big challenge or the one big opportunity that you're really looking out across 2022 and beyond for your organisation that you think that's where we're heading next? That's where I'm going to prioritise some more time and energies on. Do you want to perhaps share, and you might share your perspective on, I guess, where you guys are looking at it from MFIL's perspective?
So, as I just mentioned, we're looking at artificial intelligence, which has been around. Artificial intelligence in computers has been around since the 80s. They've made movies about it. They've prophesised what it's going to do. But we're now actually getting it to a point where it's helping. It's when we do things with MFILs, for example, if we put a document into MFILs, we have AI, we have modelling that's going to say, I think this is an invoice, I think this is for this customer, I think this is doing this. And so it's improving that end user experience, because one of the big things about any IT system is if end users don't like it, they don't use it, then it's pointless. So what we're trying to do is have that AI helping, and actually not just for technology, but to help users so that it's going to make things easy. We've now taken it the step further. Released last week was our smart migration. So we can send our AI out into your file share or into your SharePoint repositories and say you've got contracts on there that have penalty clauses and they probably shouldn't be sitting on a file share. We've got personally identifiable information somewhere and that probably shouldn't be there. So that AI part is certainly becoming, after 20 odd years, it's coming to the point where users actually will use it. Prior to that, it's been AI for the sake of technology. It's now becoming a user benefit. The only other thing that our technology is bringing forward is that collaboration. Because as we heard, everybody's working from home, everybody's working somewhere else. How do I work together with somebody? Apart from Zoom, apart from Microsoft Teams, those sort of things we're working with, MFILs has now got technology for customer hubs and things like that. So your customers can access securely the documents that they need to see, or property management people can upload their inspection reports for customers to see. So all that collaboration and that artificial intelligence, it's actually combining now to give, again, a much better user experience. So that's where I see us going with that anyway.
Terrific, thank you. David?
I think from our point of view, we've done a fair bit of the hard base work. So in the case that I spoke of with MFILs, and we're only really using it as a simple process, but we're getting high levels of acceptance and user confidence. And so the immediate future and the medium-term future will be, there's so much more we can do with it. Now the platform's in place, people know what they're doing, and they can actually speak to others who will vouch for that this is not a crazy idea. And so I think just really more of the same at probably an accelerated pace.
Terrific.
I think challenges and threats, I wouldn't mind a little bit more time before the next global pandemic. If we could
We'll see what we can do.
drag that out a little bit, that'd be handy. But I think from the opportunities, it's very much about embracement of technology, which can impact our consumer experience, and continuing to double down in areas that we can embrace the technology within our hotel environment or within a hospitality environment that actually improves our end user experience.
Terrific, thank you. Peter?
So, like I touched on at the end of my presentation, our focus will essentially be looking to integrate our accounts payable fully with our GL product. So essentially removing that need for any data entry whatsoever, as well as extending to electronic records for our clients. So that's essentially the focus over the next definitely 12 to 24 months.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in thanking our very generous panellists and presenters. And I'm now going to hand this over to John Paul to, as our host for this evening, to close proceedings and perhaps open up some more informal conversation and drinks. So, John Paul, thank you.
Thanks, Troy. Look, I'd really like to thank you, Troy. You did a great job at emceeing, way better than I could do. And I'd really like to thank the speakers for being so open and honest about the challenges and all the, I suppose, uncertainties in how you guys overcame them. And look, I think we should have drinks and some food and discuss it further. Thank you.